so that they've announced this generative UI as part of Flutter. It's basically based on Google's agents to UI sort
AD,
of
yep. Hmm.
that standard. But what's interesting for me is they've effectively, I mean, the way I look at it is they've effectively tried to package up MCP apps inside Flutter. So what it works is it's like you seem to have a chat interface, and it's not strictly a chat interface. So it's a chat interface within a Flutter. They give you a chat widget inside your Flutter app, and then the idea is that within that chat session, the Gen UI will generate whatever UI you need for to within that chat session. So you ask for show me the products you've got, it will generate a chat interface. Within the chat interface, it will generate a widget in the conversation showing you a list of products, with the rights, with images and text to go with it. So it kind of generates, based on whatever your data structure is, it generates whatever UI it thinks, but it's within that sort of chat session. And it was interesting for me because I always think of GenUI being very broad and being able to have the whole application, but it's quite and I guess it makes sense in some respects, having it constrained so it's not having to worry about too many things. But it's basically within like a chat conversation, you have this generative UI piece. And I guess
Hmm.
that's really one of the challenges with this stuff is, how do you know, how do you surface pieces like generative UI? Because it's hard to have the whole application adapt all the time. So it makes sense to have some sort of container or constraints to make it so you're not having to rebuild. You don't have to rebuild everything, and you have more. It makes it easier to kind of use and work with. But I'll bring up the standards just JC, right? So you can see what I'm talking about.
Sure. There's ADUI, there's AGUI, there's OpenUI.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, to be fair, the flow is interesting because it's one of the first ones I've seen in in a major product, the one major standard, actually using an anger. Let me have the
What, the Flutter
section.
flow is the first example you've seen of that?
Sorry, what were you saying?
I say you're saying Flutterflow is the first example you've seen of using GenUI and Anger?
Yeah, I think so. Haven't seen any other sort of big tools using something like this, so it's quite cool that they're doing this. And this is kind of how it comes across, right? It's basically, in many respects, it's kind of like an MCP app, well, how that would come across, but I guess a bit more advanced because the whole interface, the UI piece is completely generative, so it can adapt to whatever you're asking it, which is pretty cool.
Hmm.
Um, but it's it's kind of interesting to see that we haven't seen. I haven't seen a lot more people doing this in products. Have you seen anything? Either of you two seen anything like this?
I've seen quite a bit of this. This is the kind of thing that our friends at WeWeb are making a big bet on, that people are going to be using web apps that then that have a chat, but then you're going to bring these components into play, right? They're not focused on making just chat apps, but their thing is, hey, if you create a chat flow, you're going to have these UI elements coming in, and you want to have control over those UI elements coming in, and that becomes part of their low code story, right? Is that those components are things you want to have more control over. There's a company called Copilot Kit that is dropping copilots, right? Well, basically chat flows that can go with lots of e-commerce sites or other applications that then include things like, okay, here are products you might be looking for based on the conversation we're having, or to keep it just from being chat as it goes back and forth. They're going gangbusters. They just raised their Series A, and seeing that be pretty successful. A competitor to Copilot Kit that's in this business is called Thesis, Thesys.
Mhm.
They had approach, based on technology called Crayon that I never really saw take off. It was cool as an early demonstration of you doing generative UI. They more recently came out with a standard called OpenUI, and I've been
Um,
a friend of mine's been just going gangbusters with OpenUI. And the big insight he had about OpenUI is that it takes it beyond just the chat interface, and that you start to think of it as things like if you're going to have more of an open claw type interface, what you can do with something like OpenUI is you can create, have all sorts of components that work in the context of your app. Now, because this leads to a problem that I don't think is well understood, which is that when you build like a React app or one of these others, you ship this whole source code, right, of the application. And that includes like the shapes of all the components, where they're going to work, whatever, like state management, blah, 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 blah. But you might imagine that particularly having a conversation with UI, you want to just sort of spin up things that are going to be useful for the shape of the conversation you're having right now. And that is easier said than done because of this idea that the components need to have been written beforehand. The idea like, oh, it's just going to go write some code dynamically and then just jam that into the React or your Vue or whatever the actual web application is, or whatever framework you're using, is actually quite challenging, because it creates like potential additional dependencies and whatever. There's something called web components that's intended to be kind of getting around this, which requires you to use iframes all the time, which are basically like a web browser that's embedded in the web browser, like that rectangle. And that actually starts to look a lot more like the way MCP apps work, right? Because MCP apps are taking a little web browser instance, the iframe, and just jamming it inside your chat flow, and it does that to be universal, right? And so the trick is, how can you be more universal in the way that like different types of applications or different types of experiences can make use of your dynamic or generative UI, um oh, without having to pre-program everything in advance.
mm,
And that's where that's where A2UI, which is a Google thing, AGUI, which is Copilot Kit, and OpenUI, which is by Thesis. That's where these standards are kind of competing, right? Is trying to think bigger about how you can allow more, more complex UI that is generative, that you don't have to have figured out how it works in advance, right? So it's not like I'm going to manufacture a bunch of Legos and then bring back in those Legos. Like, how can you atomize it so that as the AI has imagination of, oh, wait, this is probably the best way to solve your problem, it can just sort of sweep in and solve your problem without being too limited by, these big building blocks, right? And still have it be dynamic and still not have it require someone having to go, load in an iframe or something that creates a more clunky experience. How do you keep it smoothly integrated in? And that is both that's a technical challenge and a UX challenge, all at once. And that's the reason why that's why these frameworks exist. That's why you don't see it happening a huge amount. But the places where I'm seeing it happening are definitely like in e-commerce. And I'm starting to see it more on the productivity side. And like the big demand I've seen for people making things with even like mermaid charts, which is something we've all seen like get used in sort of the chat flows, because mermaid charts are a wonderful example of things that work inside a chat flow, that don't require one of these janky iframes. But the mermaid charts themselves are just so limited. People are trying to go as far as they can, but but these other generative standards are, I think, the ones that get really much more exciting, right? In terms of creating much better experiences for people, and without having that iframe mediating things in the middle.
yeah, I mean, it is a challenge though, right? Because the more expressive and the more sort of complete that you want to get what you can draw on the canvas, the more you end up effectively building a web browser almost, right? Because you want to have it not just express graphical elements, but you want to have some interactivity in it and some complexity in terms of the interactivity.
Mhm.
So there is a bit of a tension between yeah the full having a full iframe versus having something that can not be too limited. So you're trying to figure out what that is, and as you say, it is interesting that a lot of people are trying to figure out the best way of doing this. And the trick is historically most of the web technologies are fairly heavy, right? It's not easy to spin up a UI really fast. I mean, it's getting better, but it's not. None of them really designed for out of the box to be completely dynamic and to be super fast. I think always planned to be like super built and minimized so that they're small over the wire. And I think what's interesting for me is the OpenAI UI. Actually, I just saw this recently as well. Obviously, the OpenClaw sort of focus is interesting because obviously, are you seeing, Ray, more demand from people trying to experiment with UI with the sort of the claw type of things? Because obviously, that's always been, you know, historically there's so many different ways of communicating with the open claw style stuff. They're trying to find, having something like a dynamic UI that can adjust depending on what interface it's using would be super helpful.
I'm definitely seeing more experimentation with it. I think what we're talking about right now is I mean, we're always talking about the leading edge around here, right? But but yeah, I'm seeing that be small but growing. I went to an open claw, little mini conference in Boston when I went to ODSC a few weeks ago,
Yeah,
and it was packed. It is definitely a hot area of exploration, and packed not just with techies, but with quite a number of people who are very obviously marketing people, right? So they're thinking about this on both sides, like how is this going to help, and the idea, like what does the experience look like that you know, like when you're saying I'm going to have my conversation with my personal agent, my personal agent's going to be doing things for me, how does it then communicate back to me? And thinking about the different modalities of that. Where one of the things that moves it away from MCP apps per se is that like a lot of these are, the conversation flow back is through things like Telegram or Slack or what have you,
yeah,
which don't quite have the same tools available. But then you get to the other side of it, which is then they're spinning up websites, right? To be able to have that bigger conversation. Website could even be completely transient, right? Or maybe that's just mutable, which also gets pretty interesting, sort of thinking very differently about the whole thing, because now it's like, I'm not trying to fit this widget inside the chat flow. I'm saying, let's go have this deeper part of the conversation over here. And then that deeper part of the conversation is equally mutable, equally focused on you, as opposed to being, I'm now trying to, fit you into whatever the same shape is of site that I'm doing for, 5
yeah.
million other people.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, right? Because you want to try and keep the thread of the conversation and keep the context, but actually having a multiple, I bet you want to also have the flexibility to be able to not be stuck into the limitations of whatever interface of the conversation that you're in, and how the user kind of keeps that conversation in mind and what they're so you've got an easy to work with kind of experience. Well, what about you, JC? What do you think about this stuff?
So I was thinking, so definitely I think it's well, the future of interacting with agents, yeah, like OpenClaw, where you're on different users are on different platforms, like yeah, it might be on Slack, WhatsApp, or any other server like this, and then they don't need to, well, the providers like the app providers, they don't need to care about figuring out the best way to serve their product, or translating that into UI, and when it gets surfaced, and how everything that we discuss with MCP apps. I think Gen UI is definitely the way forward to solve for that need. Now, I guess I have no idea how they're going to solve those limitations on, yeah, what can Slack uh, compile and compose in terms of UI. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be solve, or if it's an easy to solve problem. But where I am seeing, well, the only place that I've probably tested that a bit more is on Claude Cowork. That's the first, well, that and Google Gemini. Those are the two places where I started seeing what I think is Gen UI. So these platforms, they started like showing me different information in different ways based on my current context and conversation at that point. So in a different chat, in a different context, or if I was asking something different, they would come up with a completely different UI. So one example that I'm remembering now that you guys brought this up was on Claude Cowork. I was trying to kind of visualize. So I use Claude Cowork a lot to visualize the dev work, and I usually try to, well, pare it down to the design work. So it's like, okay, tell me how my backend is looking, tell me how the next plans of actions are looking like, and what is this feature and this other feature going to look like. So it is able to on the fly compose what it seems to be like an iframe with some basic HTML, compose a basic diagram or a basic mini website that I can interact with, and that serves as a wireframe for me to understand whatever information it's giving me. So that was the first time that I saw, yeah, what I think is generative UI. And maybe that's a question for you, because I'm not sure if that's um, technically generative UI or not. Maybe it's something else. But Cloud Cowork is one place where I saw that first and in my day-to-day work, and where I really think is very useful. And then the other place is in the AI that's embedded within Google. So I'm guessing it also uses Gemini or some part of some model from Gemini, but it it really does a great job at putting together like a trip. If I'm for example looking for recommendations in Barcelona for places to go or whatever, it composes a trip on the fly and shows to me in a nice looking way that is different on every conversation because of what I'm looking for. So I guess that's generative UI. I'm not sure. Maybe you can tell me if technically that is generative UI, or if they have some other way of coming up with that UI. I don't know.
I don't think anyone's got the ownership of what definition is right now. It's not like a this is what it is. I mean, I think it's pretty broad topic really, with lots of different answers, lots of different perspectives. But it's interesting what you said though. I don't know if you guys have seen this recently, but there's a bunch of articles recently about people saying using HTML for documentation instead of Markdown, which I
Yeah.
feel from what you were saying, JC, is kind of connected. I mean, obviously, for a purely static thing, it's not so useful, but some of the discussion kind of talks about making it so that it's a bit more dynamic and it actually generates not just I don't know the article here, not just like a report, but actually something where there's an interface where you can try some things out. Like, I want to look at a few range of answers, and you could generate the HTML to allow you to look at different scenarios, so you can
Yeah.
actually interact with the data. So, for me, it started going beyond just pure documentation and started moving in towards actually generating the UI that helps you answer the question you've got or do the task that you want to have. And I think, this, it seems like a lot of this is kind of coalescing around HTML as being the standard. But, I guess the question really boils down to, this kind of three-pronged issues. You've got the technical implementation, how do you fit in with what you're doing? The UX side, which is how do you make it, answering the question the user has. But I think there's also a third piece, which is particularly for businesses, how do I maintain my brand throughout all of this user interface or the user experience? Make sure that I'm not compromising, I'm using all my design tokens and my brand marks, and they're coming through in terms of what I'm presenting. So I've got a consistent story and I'm not doing random, schemes depending on what I'm trying to present. And I think that's one of the things that I don't see people focusing on enough. I think most of it is about technical and UX. There's not a lot of people thinking about this. I mean, that's not true. I have seen some pieces talking about this around that sort of brand side, but I think that's going to become equally important when we start seeing a bigger uptake of this, because people need to make sure that they represent all their brand stuff in the right way.
That's a very good point. I think maybe a possible solution to that, or maybe another path that this takes, is that the visual element of a brand is not that relevant anymore in a chat conversation, and maybe the brand kind of translates their brand awareness to basically the tone of voice, or like the length of the responses. So there's another way that is not purely visual on the UI elements that it surfaces, but maybe on how the LLM responds, or how the agent behaves. Maybe that becomes a new way to convey the brand in a chat conversation.
I would disagree with that. I mean, again, it may change, but I feel like human response, being able to see, certain colors and logos, and even just visual representations, makes you remember things, right? That's one
Hmm.
of the points of why sponsorship and branding is so critical, because the recall then happens, and you go, when you get to choice, that subconscious is saying, this is something I've seen before, and I've associated with something good, and I want to see it again. And that's why logos are important to keep representing. That's why people sponsor things and put their brand everywhere, because that recall and just the subconscious triggers it causes is super helpful for making sure you become the choice when people are presented with different options. So I think, maybe over time it will change, but for the vast, I would say, certainly for the next period, humans kind of have that visual recognition that they use making choices, and I think it is a really important thing. And I think the difficulty has is if you're constantly changing the colors or logos, or even some of the ways and representations of data, you'll lose some of that connection with the brand. And I think people want to have that, and certainly and certain parts of the UX that become important. Like some brands are well known for being very clean, like Apple, like classic white, very clean, very sort of minimalist. They always want to have that represented in what they do. Sometimes they've obviously got color coming in now, but it's a very minimalist approach to how they represent things, which is very different from the sort of Baroque, complex that you get maybe in some of the luxury brands, right? They're very different representations, and if you can immediately see documentation or UX from Apple and know it's an Apple product, right? And so you have that association and that visual recognition. And that's a really important part in anything we're talking about in terms of generative UI, because, you're reinforcing the brand. And I'm sure that people will want to have that. And I think, whenever you're thinking about doing this, you need to think of a way of bringing that in to whatever you're generating so that it's not missed.
I think that sounds about right, Toby, and I think it's going to be an incredible money-making opportunity because there with there's the old expression, right? You can have there are three legs to the stool, right? There's good, fast, and cheap, right? And what we have right now is a market that's moving quickly enough that if it's not fast, you're just not playing. There are some brands that have chosen not to play. I propose actually you brought up Apple. Apple is a brand that's not playing, right? They stuck their toe in the water with Apple Intelligence and basically pulled their toe back out. They're waiting this thing out, and I think
Yeah.
there are a number of us who are going to say that this is all way too frothy, right? We're going to wait for this thing to settle out, and once it settles out, we'll go play in it. And then there are other brands who are looking to get into it and be figuring out what's going on. Actually, they're probably going to have to spend significantly in order to do it, not because any given initiative is going to be super expensive, but because there's just so much change, right? They're like multiple standards. We're trying to figure out like what does all this stuff look like. They're not going to take the fast moving thing and make it slow. They will need to exist in the fast moving environment, and that's going to be you know, uh, probably expensive for them to do, but they will get to claim territory, right? in this, sort of more chaotic world today that, could have some payoff for them, afterwards. And being able to do that well, right, being good, and being fast, I think it becomes a big potential source of advantage for them. And then you get to what I think is JC's point, which is the other category of company that's going to do well in the space. So I think the people are going to wait it out, right? I could play in this, or I could wait, right? They choose wait. There's going to be a category of people who decide they're going to play in this. And that's going to be, I think, significant and exciting and require quite a bit of technical assistance and nativity assistance, even as they have their brand people. And they will probably need to take some risks with it, but those risks can be mitigated through putting enough resource against it. And then you have category number 3, which are going to be the native brands. And we saw this in each of the sort of previous generations, right? Netflix is a brand that's native to the web, right? Even though they weren't originally doing streaming, it was always a web native business, right? Because that was why you ordered your DVDs, right? As opposed to, say, Blockbuster, which got into the same business that Netflix was in, the DVD ordering business, but they weren't in a web native business. And you can sort of maybe tell that story a little bit as, the conservatism of not being native and not, making the investments necessary in order to be able to win in this relatively fast moving space that eventually, then we know the story of what happened to Blockbuster. Um, so I think there's going to be a segmentation, right? So which brands are going to be, looking to say there's enough opportunity for them to gain from this that they want to play in here? Which ones are going to just batten down the hatches and wait it out for the 24, 36-month period of the chaos in here before they come back with their significant bankrolls and say, okay, now it's time we can be Gucci again? Or is Gucci going to be, playing with the edges here? And I just don't know which way that's going to go. But probably important to being able to be successful in the space is figuring out which brands are inclined to go which way, which ones have the psychology of we're going to try to wait it out versus we're going to play. And then also, hey, who's native to the space that's going to create the really outsized opportunities because they are creating something from where before there was nothing.
I mean, yeah, I think you're right. There's going to be significant opportunity in this, and I'm wondering maybe that's something that we could be looking at, and that this idea of generative UI including brand is kind of an interesting combination that not everybody will be thinking about, but actually is super valuable for the brands that really care about it, and they're
Yep.
probably the least be able to cope with it. The technical people will be generating all sorts of UIs for whatever they need to do, but
Mhm.
actually having some input to say we want it not only to do it from a good UX, but also good UX plus a good brand, or maintaining our brand, and kind of codifying what our brand is. What are the brand representations that need to be implemented in when we're thinking about generating UX? That's a really useful kind of utility to be able to people to plug in to say, to kind of filter through whatever's being generated to make sure that it's delivering what it needs to. It's things like that I think are going to be, where this is going to go next. Yes, it's really there's some I think there's some really, really, well, as always, there's a lot of really interesting opportunities in this, and you just got to think about, you've got to pick one you think is going to work and is going to resonate with people, and in a time frame that you can deliver and hit it, I guess. But I do feel like generative AI combining with brand is a really powerful thing that people are going to want to have. Um, and it's still super early yet. I mean, we still, as you say, there's multiple standards right now, and nothing is really winning yet. We're starting to see products using it, but not really, sort of flying just yet. So it's still very early.
Maybe one question on the standards. What is the difference between these three main standards that you presented, or that you also mentioned, right? Why are they competing and why are they different, I guess?
I think they're competing for the same reason standards always compete, which is not invented here, right? A2UI is a Google standard. It's about a year old, I think, and it's very, very Android first. I don't think the Flutter is built on A2UI. I could be wrong about that, but it sort of runs parallel to it. AGUI, which is Copilot Kit's play into this, and then OpenUI, which is Thesis's play into this. I think the reason why, and people make multiple standards because each of the companies says, well, we like this aspect of the standard. We built technology around it, so we're going to keep on going down this road. It's one of the reasons why, other agentic communications platforms, protocols like, A to A. I think A to A has made some progress, but still has a lot of, it's not widely adopted, right? In fact, A to A, even though it's a Google standard, probably is most widely adopted, I think, by Microsoft, right, through Teams. The so I think in general you're going to find that, like, hey, a standard comes out. Why are people not using the standard, or why are there multiple standards? It's because that's just kind of the way things sort out at the beginning, and it's going to be through acceptance or usage in the market. And usually it's because the underlying idea that it needs to be big enough, and there needs to be enough value in associating with the standard that you finally get the winner take all aspect of the standard. Otherwise, these things can perfectly fine remain disparate because you have one company that builds their app on OpenUI, and that builds their app on A2UI, and they're not harmed because of it. Contrast that with like MCP apps, right? MCP apps benefit from being a standard because then if I make an MCP app, it could run in all these different environments that use MCP apps. But even then, it's still not that huge, at least not yet, right? And the key to MCP app success, I would posit, is because of Anthropic. Anthropic, championing MCP and saying we're going to build this into Claude, and then and they were big enough, right? They weren't as big, I think, in terms of like their competition with ChatGPT in like 2024 when they first came out with MCP. But by the time we're talking about MCP apps in, at the end of 2025, obviously ChatGPT is getting into it. Their first version of this was called ChatGPT apps. And then like the MCP UI folks from Shopify, the MCP, the ChatGPT apps kind of come together to form this one standard so that you can build with one technology and work both in ChatGPT and Claude. That becomes a good reason to have that standard, right? It was the advocacy of one of the biggest players in the space and the willingness of the other big player in the space to get over their not invented here. So I think there's that combination of it's got to be a big enough market, has to be a few enough players. There has to be a big advantage to having the standard over having it be disparate. And you need to have someone be able to get over their ego. Psychology, so much stuff.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, it's interesting to see. I mean, there's nothing. I don't think there hasn't. I think any talk of any kind of Gen UI in the MCP standard itself, right? As far as I can figure out, the next few iterations of the uh, MCP standard are mostly focused on like this transport layer stuff rather than the actual UI stuff. The MCP apps extension. I don't think there's anything generative coming in there, but yeah, it's kind of
Well, that's actually important for MCP UI because, the original MCP UI actually did have generative UI blocks to it, in addition to having the widget. But all anybody really used was the widget version. Like it had other simpler, like, feedback blocks that you could put in, like an image block and other kind of blocks. And they sort of, I think, have simplified it just to like, let's just have it be the widget, and the widget you just run a web browser inside there, and then that way, all the Gen UI aspects of it are not things that the rest of the chat agent needs to even think about,
yeah,
because
yeah,
otherwise
yeah.
your assumptions about the technology that the chat environment is running on, right? Like is it running in Swift environment, like the Claude mobile app? Is it running in Electron? Is it running whatever Goose is using for its displays? You sort
Yeah.
of get to separate yourself by turning those things into iframes, or iframes if you're in a web browser, or like just uh, you know, web browser embeds, right? Like which have different names depending on which platform you're in, that just get jammed into these other environments. And how do you otherwise solve that problem? Well, that requires more of an awareness of what's going on in terms of how the renderer works. So either you're creating a new meta language, right, that then all these things have to support, or you're assuming they're all built on the same technology. And the former is a big technical and cost challenge and certainly reliability challenge, and the latter is just ain't going to happen. So there's a little bit
Yeah,
of how do these things fit together?
and I guess it's always a trade-off, right? Is that you want to have it so you own all the stack, or do you just want to own the piece and let people kind of, innovate on some other parts of it? And I guess, for maximizing the adoption, focusing on the sort of the exposing of an iframe and let people figure out what they want to do gives them much wider audience than being more prescriptive about what actually goes into that. So, if you're trying to get the standard in place, you want to try and make it as easy as possible to integrate with whatever people are using, I guess that makes sense. Interesting. Interesting.
Interesting. Also to see how HTML is basically making a very big comeback in what seems to be the leading edge technology right now. It's in the end we will be using HTML, it seems, for for most of the richer experiences.
Well, it's hard to get away from because there's so much support for it, and the JVMs are so heavily optimized that they can they're I mean it's quite hard to catch up with it in terms of being able to deliver. It's not probably it's a bit heavy for probably trying to do some of this stuff, but I mean it's so everywhere. It's difficult to argue with, I guess.
It also leans into how local compute is cheap, because we have far more processing horsepower running locally on our machines. I think people might be surprised how many of the apps that they're running today on, say, Windows or Mac that seem like, hey, it's just sort of it's a native application, and this looks like a Windows application, or it looks like a Mac application, but it's actually running a web browser underneath to actually run
Yeah,
its UI.
yeah, that's true. That's true. Because it's so easy for people. It's getting lazy. I mean, I love all the the comparisons where people say, the image that you look at on your screen for an icon is bigger than some of the games that used to be written on 32K computers, which could last you hours and hours of playing. It's insane what people used to do and how ridiculously inefficient people have got to now with all the libraries they incorporate and all the stuff that they do. Whereas actually, if you were really, really tight about it, you can do incredible things in a very small amount of space. And the processing now is you get so memory is so much that people just don't care, and so they just you can get away with things which you couldn't possibly have thought about in the past.
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, like CGA graphics back from the early 1980s was 320 by 200. That's about 64,000 pixels that would have been on the screen. VGA graphics, which were considered a huge step up, like when I was younger, like from the like late 1980s, early 1990s. That would be 640 by 480, which is around like what 300,000 pixels there on the screen. Right now, talking to you gentlemen, I am looking at a 4K monitor, which is 4,000 by 2,000. That is 8 million pixels on the screen, and right now I've got three of them going across in my workshop. That's 24 million pixels. That's compared to like 64,000 that was there 40
It's
years ago.
crazy, isn't it?
So like your point is absolutely well taken. Like this stuff just keeps on shifting, and the tiny phone that we have here. One of the reasons why these phones are as useful as they're got as much pickup as they are is because it wasn't just 20 somethings who were picking them up. Right, the first generation of this technology, you saw younger people using them, you didn't see any older people using them. The reason for that was they were hard to read, the blocky text. If you can see the pixel, it's actually harder for the human eye to get its mind around. This thing here has 2 million pixels on it. It was about 1,000 by 2,000 roughly. And the because it has 2 million pixels, you can't actually see any of those pixels with the human eye. And because they're smaller than what the human eye can perceive, they're actually easier for older eyes to perceive. That's one of the reasons why the iPhone got so popular so fast, especially as compared with Android in the first world countries, is because they got there faster with the high resolution screens and what they call the Retina screens. The changes in UI that we have, some of them are about like ideas we have about how to be more generative or what have you, but some of it's just straightforwardly, increasing pixel density increases the options we have to deliver high quality experiences and help people make better decisions.
Yes,
Very
well, that's
interesting
interesting.
how
Very
things
cool.
evolve, and we'll try to keep up and try to discuss it. Right. So it was a pleasure as always, and I think we'll keep an eye on the generative UI because it's very interesting how it ties back to MCP UI, MCP apps, and we'll see how things evolve. And yeah, see you on the next one.